Okay, hello. I think we can get started now. Thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you for being here. My name is Thabo Lene. I'm the Managing Director of the Goldsmith Sustainable Agriculture Fund here at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. So in recognition of the intersectionality of energy, climate, and agriculture, the center set up the fund a year ago. And so we're really excited to have our inaugural visiting scholar today, Lindiwe Majele Sibanda. The format of this event, just for the housekeeping, will include a presentation by Professor Sibanda, followed by a conversation with Presidential Penn Compact Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Center for Africana Studies, Professor Wale Adebanwi. And then we'll end with opening with a Q&A to the audience. So now that the housekeeping is done, by way of introduction, Professor Sibanda is an animal scientist and a practicing farmer with extensive experience as a policy advisor to numerous African governments and global institutions. She was appointed to the CGIAR System Board in April 2021 and became the global chair in January 2023. She's a member of the Nestlé Global Board, where she serves on the Sustainability Committee and is a board representative on creating Shared Value Council. She serves as the chair of the council at the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe and is an extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House and a member of Champions 12.3, Accelerating Progress on UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDG Target 12.3, Halving Global Per Capita Food Waste. She has served in senior leadership positions in various organizations, from the Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems at the University of Pretoria in South Africa to the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. We're truly honored to have her with us today and this week. Welcome to the stage, Professor Sibanda.
Thank you, Thabo. We agreed you didn't have to read all that, but it's okay. It's really a great joy to be here. And yesterday I started off on a high because I visited the Bolton Center, and that just made me feel at home. Seeing the animals walking around a farm just took me back to my roots. So I want to believe jet lag is over and I belong here. Thank you for having me. So there's always pressure when you are the inaugural speaker, but I will try and keep it simple. I'm going to share with you my experiences, starting with time in the 60s, 70s, where I spent at least 3 months every year at Gogo Maembe's farm. Gogo is the Zulu name for grandma, and the tradition is such that schooling is in the city, but every school holiday, all children are shipped to their grandparents. We always thought it was a good time to go and connect and be with grandma and eat all the traditional foods we don't get in the city. But now in retrospect, I realize that the school holidays were aligned to the peak agricultural activity season. So we were the free labor for the farms. So maybe it's no surprise that agriculture is in my blood. I just enjoy farming. And thanks to Gogo Maembe, who taught me the basics of how to feed your family. But for her at that time, her 1 hectare farm was more than just a garden for feeding us. It was her pharmacy and it was her source of income. And you can't think of anything more in sustainability terms where you feed the soil, you feed your pocket, and you also feed your children and your grandchildren. That's the memory I have of my grandmother. The energy, the draft power came from donkeys, as you can see from the picture there. We cooked on an open fire with firewood we fetched from this forest. We carried water from a well that she dug at the corner of her 1 hectare plot. And I just wanted to relive that experience. And I had the joy last year of going back. That's me in that overall, to try and see if I could still do what we used to do, carry the 20-liter bucket of water without spilling a drop as you carry the water from the well to the household. Luckily, I passed the test. The chickens were free ranging, but those were specially for visitors. But every school holiday without fail, a goat was slaughtered for the grandchildren. At any one time will be 20 plus. And grandma would cut small pieces such that we could afford 20 grams of meat every day for the 30-day school holidays for each one of us. I used to watch and say, I wish one day I would be rich and be able to afford meat more than that one piece. And lo and behold, I went and studied animal science, and I now own and run a commercial beef producing farm in Zimbabwe. So maybe that's a prayer answered, for though I've slowed down on eating the meat for obvious reasons. That is a picture of the commercial farm that I run. That's where I live in Zimbabwe. There is nothing that beats farming in terms of just relaxing, enjoying being in touch with nature. But for a scientist, there is nothing as humbling as being a farmer and you know the science. Half the science and the innovations you generate are so difficult to apply on the farm because at times it just doesn't make economic sense. At times the returns or the inputs required are just beyond what you can afford. And at times you just care for the soil and you want to do things different. So when they say farmers are slow at adopting technologies, they're smart, they know why, and they know what's good for them at any one time. And that's why I've kept in touch with the soil. It humbles me and it sharpens my role as a policy advisor because I can relate to real life experiences, but also to the cloud science that we try and bring to the farmer for innovations. Now, what's the best thing that's happened in my world? In 2021, rather, when I went to school and studied agriculture, I remember my father saying, why would you go and study what your grandmother can do and does so well? What's so special about farming? I argued that agriculture was a science, and to him was a science, then what? You science, you do agriculture, and then you feed people. And grandma's always done that. The best thing that happened in 2021 is when the Secretary General of the United Nations pronounced that there will be a special General Assembly which will focus on food systems. For the first time, agriculture would transition from being just agriculture, which we associate with farming, to food systems, which meant from farm to fork. What that meant, if you follow the cycle, I wish I could expand that, is that food systems instead of agriculture now relates to all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. From farm, you're looking at the inputs, you're looking at the production, you're looking at the harvesting and storage, you're looking at the processing, you're looking at the transportation, you're looking at the manufacturing, you're looking at delivery at the household, and you're looking at consumption. What that has done is to expand agriculture into food systems, and I want to underline two things. The food, which we had commoditized, agriculture had become a commodity game. You produce so that you sell, and you never worried about the quality of what you produced. You never worried about the quality of the soil you left behind. The game was go, go, go. Production meant more for more. Put more fertilizer into the soil, get more yields. Don't worry much about the damage you leave behind. But under food systems, we're saying from farm to fork, worry about the system. What you put in, what you get, and what you leave behind. But what is interesting for this group is that if you look at the first graphic there, the number of times you have the word transport. Transport in pink, transport in pink, transport in pink, transport in pink. That's how much energy goes into the food systems game. You are transporting things all the time, right? From inputs that you bring into the farm, the tractors you use on the farm, the produce you transport out of the farm, the produce you transport out of the manufacturing plants to your households. So that is why no wonder that agriculture is the second biggest emitter when we look at greenhouse gases. The second graphic is really looking at regenerative agriculture. When I went to school, we used to talk about conservation agriculture, and the three tenets were crop rotation, diversified crops, don't plant the same thing all the time. Number three, minimum tillage, minimum disturbance of the soil, and always have soil cover. We have evolved in the narrative, and the big trending narrative now is regenerative agriculture. And in that graphic, I try and portray the four pillars of that regenerative agriculture. But the basics is improve your soil, water, and carbon restoration. That's what we try to do with conservation agriculture. Number two, support livelihoods. It means deliver nutrient-dense foods. Number three, decrease pesticide use as you follow the regen cycle. And number four, enhance biodiversity. Don't disturb what's in the soil that doesn't need to be taken out. Now, all that defies what we were taught during my time, which was more, remove everything, plant corn, it's got the best prices, and you'll get rich fast. Now we want to do what my grandmother used to preach, feed the soil so that it feeds you, and then you can feed your family. So this is the new cycle that we are in, from sustainable food systems, regenerative agriculture. And the third graphic speaks about the planetary boundaries. There are boundaries that have been established through science that we should not transgress. But unfortunately, we've been pushing on those boundaries as we try to produce more. Freshwater use, climate change, land use change, biodiversity loss, all these are boundaries that we should have respected. But unfortunately, in the game of more, we have crossed most of those. The question becomes, what do we do to reverse the damage? I am privileged to be associated with an entity called CGIAR. This is the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research, which has a global mandate. Our mandate is really to have a world with sustainable and resilient food, land, and water systems that deliver diverse, healthy, safe, sufficient, and affordable diets, and ensures improved livelihoods, greater social equality, and plays within the planetary and regional environmental boundaries. That's what the entity delivers. We've got 10,000 staff working across 80 countries. And what I depict there are the headquarters. Most of our centers are over 50 years old. And unfortunately, they were set up on a commodity basis. We have in Mexico, CIMIT, it is specializing in maize and wheat. I'm just pick a few. IMWI in Colombo is just looking at water. IRRI, IRRI, is in Los Banos. They specialize on rice, International Rice Research Institute. And I'll take you down to Africa. ICRAF C4, they specialize on agroforestry, trees. And then ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. I joined the ILRI board. That's where I cut my teeth as a governor at global level in 2009. By 2012, I was appointed board chair. ILRI is the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Because of my background, animal science, I was co-opted as a governor there, and I chaired the board for 3 years. Even though I now chair the overall board for all the 13 out of the 15 centers, I'm never shy to say my heart is always with ILRI because I farm livestock. I was trained as an animal scientist. I went in to do animal science so that I generate more goat meat. But most important, that's the science that I live every day, right from my childhood. So my talk will focus on regenerative agriculture, but also share with you the strategy that ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, has come up with for the next 5 years, 2025 to 2030. That picture is drawn from the pictures I took last year at Gogo Mayembe's farm, where I can now connect the science that this matriarch lived every day. Look at the biodiversity on the extreme left of my side. Look at the livestock feeding on crop residues. Look at the health of that soil. The soil I have on my commercial farm is 1/10 in terms of quality compared to what that 1 hectare farm had. And look at the trees on a 1 hectare farm. Those are mango trees. And water stewardship. We practiced precision watering, where with a bucket we would go one by one on the plants. That's what drip irrigation does through better technology. But my grandmother knew that we had to conserve the water, and at critical times, we had to line up with buckets and go and put a drop per plant. So I thought I should just share that. How do we reimagine farming and livestock production from farm to fork? What are the challenges and opportunities that the food system faces? I will be sharing the ILRI strategy, International Livestock Research Institute. Their vision is people's lives, particularly in low and middle income countries, are improved through livestock science that contributes to equitable and resilient livestock systems in order to deliver food systems transformation with climate and environmental benefits. That's the focus. Now, what are the strategic interventions? We've got 4. First, we cannot ignore that there's an issue of a livestock discourse. There's the good about livestock, there's the bad, which we should not shy away from, but there's also the ugly, which is the emissions, and the worst of those is methane, which is the most potent greenhouse gas that we are trying to grapple with. So how do we as an international research institute generate evidence that can be used to advocate for more animal source foods, but less damage to the environment? Second, how do we track the demand? You know, we've got to know what we are dealing with. There are some continents, there are some countries where livestock is bad. You cannot put your neck out and speak for livestock. So I'm being brave. I will tell you why I'm being brave. Then the third component is the interface, livestock, climate, and the environment. In there's the good. You saw the good soil from Gogo Mayembe's farm, where the organic matter is really coming from the livestock on the farm and the crop residues. What do you do in a system where you don't have livestock? How do you fertilize that soil? Are you doing good by excess fertilizer, or are there alternatives by having a crop livestock interface system? And then finally, livestock within food systems. Why do we need animal source food? Of course, in any complex nexus issue, there's always trade-offs, synergies, and different scenarios we can project, and I'll try and showcase those. The livestock discuss. Unfortunately, whenever you talk livestock now, they're bad for climate because livestock are the biggest emitters of methane, as I've already said. And the bad thing about methane is that it is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and it stays longer in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. We cannot solve the climate change game without addressing the methane challenge. And that's why for most livestock research, all roads lead to how do we contain this methane challenge. So livestock is not all bad, but we have to take head on the methane challenge. There's been all sorts of protests about no meat, but always remember that there are people without a choice. When we say no meat, if we look at the statistics for a country like USA, The average per capita consumption for meat is 124 kilograms per year. If you go to my world, country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's 1 to 3 kilograms per capita per year. So can we really stand up and say no meat to DR Congo in a place where anemia is high, mortality rate is up to 30% for children born from mothers who don't have enough iron in their blood because they can only get access to 3 kilograms of meat? So that balanced nuance in our discourse is important, and it has to be evidence-based. Meat, excuse me, is seen as a luxury. Let's talk milk. For a country like USA, consumption is 254 kilograms of milk per capita per year. Liberia, 3.5 kilograms per year. How do you raise children and stretch 3.5 kilograms to 365 days a year? It means a drop per child per day. So let's use evidence to redress where there are damages or where there's wrong, but to balance out, and that's what ILRI is about. So what you see there is really the consumption and why we need to be talking about livestock and balancing out. Why is livestock important in the global food systems? 1.7 billion people depend on livestock just for their general livelihood. 60% of the rural households depend on livestock. You saw on Gogo Maembe's farm where donkeys pulling the cart. We have a dairy cow. We had one dairy cow and it produced milk at household level. Luckily, the average for Zimbabwe is 30 kilograms of milk consumption per capita per year, which shows there's been investment in research and development. There's been education on the role of milk, and there's a culture of being self-sufficient at household level. Livestock contributes up to 40% of gross domestic product for most of the low-income countries. And we've had up to 1.2 million deaths as a result of antimicrobial resistance. That's vaccines being used the wrong way. The stats are clear. Foodborne diseases are costing the economy 110 billion. And as a result of climate change, we are seeing decimation of herds. On my own commercial farm, I've had to cut the herd by 60% because 5 years ago, we had a very bad drought and we lost animals. In anticipation of the El Nino for 2024, I was one of the few brave ones who said, take them to the market. And lo and behold, we had the worst season in the past 10 years. And imagine if I hadn't made that evidence-based decision. So what is the future of these households if we are not using science to generate evidence that informs policies? We cannot say no livestock. What we need to do is how do we balance the discourse and how do we generate the evidence that is required? That picture shows you the share of total livestock derived foods from small farms. And as you can see, small farms are really the major suppliers globally of animal source foods. If you look at Africa, up to 72% of our animal source foods are coming from small farms. It's 8% here in the USA, but the rest of the world, you're really talking big time manufacturing happening in farms such as Gogo Maembe's farm that I portrayed, although the size can go up to 20 hectares. So what science can we generate for these small farms to thrive, to feed their families, but also to feed the whole nation? And that's why you need public good institutions where the knowledge is not privatized, but it is used to inform policy development in these countries. There are different types of production systems. There's the mixed livestock crop production system, and that's the one I grew up under, where we had livestock, we had the crops, but the whole thing is that it was an interconnected system. You also have the pastoral systems, And we always say Ethiopia is the capital, the Horn, East Africa Horn, most of that and a bit of Nigeria practices the Fulani pastoral system, where animals in large droves are just grazing on open lands. Water has been the biggest challenge under those systems. How do you make sure that there's a balance between the numbers, productivity of the animals, and the natural resource base? Then there's the semi-intensive system. As you will note, nothing close to the factory production systems that you have in the north, which is why when we protest and say no to livestock, we have to be context-based. We have to be aware that there are different production systems, and some of these systems are very good for the environment. What's happening to the demand for animal source foods? If you look at the 10 most traded commodities or foods, from pig meat to tomatoes, you find that livestock demand is on the rise. It's on the rise because of increased population in our low middle income countries, but also increased income. As you get more money, you can afford more protein dense foods and you go up the ladder. You can see pig meat, cattle meat, chicken meat, raw milk. We jump the rice, maize, wheat, soybean. Then we go to eggs. Those are the top 5 out of 10 are animal source foods. And that's what's on the rise, and the demand is more. And our role as ILRI is to make sure as we meet that demand, we do it in a sustainable way. We get more of those foods, but we also feed the environment, which is protect the soils. We reduce the emissions that come from livestock, but we also make sure socially you are producing nutrient-dense foods that can nourish people. We have a population of 2 billion out of 7 billion in the world that are malnourished, and malnourishment being either obese or stunted, all extremes. Stunted because they don't get sufficient micronutrients in the food that they eat, it's empty calories. Obese because at times they don't have the diversity. Of course, there's the other components that contribute to that. But our foods are not diverse enough and they are not nutrient dense enough, particularly in low and middle income countries. How do we serve a world that needs this the most? Through science. The fourth component of the strategy speaks to climate change. I've already touched on that. But what I've experienced as a farmer myself is that we speak climate change in general context. The biggest challenge, water, you can plan for, reduce your stock. But where I've had the most challenge is pests and diseases. Our bill for controlling diseases has shot up. We are seeing new diseases that we never had before, either because it's suddenly too hot for too long, the seasons have changed, or it's too humid at a time when it's not supposed to be. So your general vaccination pattern is just thrown out of the window, and you have to think out of the box on how you cope. But that is where the antimicrobial resistance is also coming in, because farmers are using all sorts of vaccines out of panic. That's where research comes in. How do we prepare for a future that is climate challenged? There's then the other risks of costs of inputs. There is the conflicts of our resources as we have less water, the farmers, and there's immigration out of areas where you find you can no longer generate your livelihood out of farming or out of the food system. You move to what we call greener pastures because you believe there are better policies. And it's no wonder that we have people dying in the seas trying to cross over to look for better pastures as in better opportunities and income. So the risks are high, and we need science that will provide the right policies for people to stay where they are and mitigate the challenges they face, but most important, produce sustainably. I've got there the relationship between agriculture and climate. As I said, agriculture is the second biggest emitter. If you break down those emissions, we find that the biggest is really the ruminant enteric fermentation, the processes in the gut of the animal which lead to carbon emissions and methane are what scientists are grappling with. How do you play around with that rumen system to reduce the amount of methane? It was interesting at the Bolton Center to see how they are seized with work on that. How do you change the feed? How do you select animals through breeding that have low emissions? We found that there is a gene that can control that. How do you have additives that the animal ingests that can then reduce or arrest the methane within the tummy? All that is research that requires funding. There's also the issue of soil fertilization that we are grappling with. There's the amount of fertilizer which is not applied according to quantities. Most of it runs out, pollutes our rivers, but most important, has emissions that contribute to carbon in the air. So rice pastures are a big source of emissions as well, and we are dealing with that. Energy is the big one. As you saw, the transport in the food system, there's energy everywhere. How do we reduce that demand? Maybe we have to go back to donkey power because you don't need a big tractor on a 1 hectare farm. How do you balance the equation? So, and manure management. How do you make sure that your manure, that is a natural product from the livestock system, is disposed in a way that adds to our production system without polluting? Luckily, methane is a valuable gas if we can capture it right. So part of the work that's being done through research is how do you bring back into a circular system what we call the bed of livestock and turn it into the good. We are looking at the different production systems, and that graphic shows you what is the biggest challenge within a production system. If you look at the pastoral and agro-pastoral system, that red shows you the enteric fermentation. Because these are free-ranging animals, the quality of the pastures is not always the best. Where can you intervene and get the maximum returns? That's what that is showing. So it's depicting smallholder dual system, smallholder specialized, pasture-fed system, and a high input, high output system. So by investing in research and science, we try and tell a better story for each production system on where do you push the lever in order to do good for the economy, do good for social purposes, but most important, do good for the environment. And that's a complex nexus that we are dealing with under the food systems research. And I couldn't think of a better way of depicting it than in livestock. If I had chosen the Rice International Research Institute on rice, it would be one crop. But livestock, because they feed on grass, gives you a better picture of the contribution of agriculture food systems into greenhouse gas emissions. As CGIAR, we've come up with 5 impact areas. We don't do research for publication. As I said, we're addressing real life problems in low and middle income countries. And the 5 are really, we are looking at number 1, environmental health and biodiversity. And the examples I've shown show you what we are doing in terms of intervention to contribute to positive environmental health and biodiversity. The second one is gender equality, youth and social inclusion. Little story there that generally for most of our low and middle income countries, the women own the chickens, and if they're really advanced, they go up to goats. That's why my grandmother could slaughter a goat anytime. The big one, the cattle, belong to the men. And through our research, we're doing empowerment studies where we show that, diversify, open up. And we've seen that those women who've moved up the ladder to own cattle are better stewards of that asset. So that's part of the work. And then on youth, average age of farmers in most of these low middle income countries is 60. And there's been very few aspirants who want to do work in agriculture. Why? It's low income, it's manual, and it just is not as attractive as other professions. But by opening up the food system, it means you can enter either as an input provider, as a manufacturer and processing, as a transporter. It's just created more opportunities for youth to see an attractive career in food systems as opposed to farming. Farming, because of the intensity of the manual labor, has not been attractive. Nutrition, health, and food security, that's the big one. We've moved away from commodities, which is why under CGIAR, we now have what we call one CGIAR. Each of the commodity centers has its mandate, like ILRI, but under one CGIAR, which is the board I chair, we say no one center can transform a food system. We've come together under one banner to work on systems transformation. And the system that we are grappling with is the land system, the water system, and the food system in the face of climate change. And livestock has a lot that it contributes. Climate change adaptation and mitigation, I've spoken about methane, I've spoken about the pastures, and finally, poverty reduction, livelihoods, and jobs. Those are the 5 impact areas for all our research. We have to tick the box and make sure we contribute to that. So it's no longer research for publications. We are rewarded for showing the impact that the research contributes towards changing livelihoods. I just wanted to end that segment by highlighting what one of my champions, Gordon McClymont from Australia. I had the opportunity to deliver a memorial lecture for Australia last year. And one of the favorite phrases he coined was that all flesh is grass. We need to nurture animals, our plants, and nature. In turn, they will nourish us. And I thought there's no better way to show that balance, that we need the livestock, we need the natural environment and the plants for us to have a well-balanced life. You can read more about that ILRI strategy. It's there online, and I'll leave these slides as well. Quick one on something that really excites me. And I think the things that are exciting me, sunset stage, is the things that take me back to my grandmother's stage. This is a program that we launched last year. It's called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. And we've got a publication in Nature there, where really this vision talks about the opportunity crops that we have neglected. We've gone for commodity, corn, soybean, all the fancy things, and we have forgotten about healthy diets, we've forgotten about healthy soils, and we've forgotten about what the impact of climate change is on these crops. Can we go back to our gene banks and find resilient crops? We went back, and there you see one of my champions. He's the Food Security Ambassador, Kerry Fowler. He got the World Food Prize last year. He is the champion for VAX, and he co-opted me as his co-chair. And we together agreed that these will not be called orphaned crops because they used to eat them in my grandmother's farm. When you go to the city, you don't find them. They used to be called female crops because they'd never received any investment on research and improvement. So they were the backward ones. You eat them once a year and you're done. But now we've found, after researching on them, that they are nutrient dense and they are climate smart. So we have a program that's hosted by FAO, the United Nations Food Agriculture Organization, CIMMYT, our Maize and Wheat Center, which is driving systems transformation, and as part of CGIAR. What are those crops? I'm sure you're dying to see. I've just done a select list, and some of you will recognize them. Fonio has been flagged. I'm seeing some nodes. There's Chef Pierre, who's been flagging that one. These are things that we ate from our grandmothers, and it's such a joy to see kale now being flagged as a novelty crop. Yet for me, it was really, you mean America is now big on kale? We have that in our backyard for free. You don't pay anything. Pigeon peas, yams, okra, African eggplant, leb, just to show you a few. We've got a list from cereals, roots and tubers, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and trees. All these are the forgotten crops that we had neglected. We had not put any money in researching. The few we have pulled out in this indicative list shows these are the crops and foods of the future. They are climate resilient and they are nutrient dense. So why not put more money into bringing them to the shelf? What that would take is, normally when my grandmother cooked, it would take 5 hours. More energy, more time, because it was a culture. Now, research has to go into how do we bring them to the supermarket? How do we bring them to your pantry and make them easy to process, easy to cook? And that's the new call for investments. I thought I would share this story of the leb bean, a multi-purpose African bean, which was very popular in Kenya before colonization. They got developed through colonization, in brackets, and leb was banned because it was a backward crop. Lo and behold, it's now in our list of the novelty crops, and Kenya has gone back to plant it big time. What does that say about where Gogo Mayembe was ahead of her time? She understood what nutrient density is and what climate resilience is. So we're filling in the pantries. We're putting more research into these areas. Let me end again with my new hero, Gordon McClymont, whose second quote I would like to share is that the economic health of any country, and so the standard of civilization which it will support, rests on the fertility of its soils and the resultant productivity of its pastures, livestock, and crops. I thank you.
Thank you for that incredibly insightful presentation, Professor Sibanda. I think now we'll pull some chairs forward and invite Professor Adebwani and Professor Sibanda up for a facilitated conversation.
Thank you very much, Professor Sibanda, for that excellent talk. There's so much there to unpack, and I can only speak to a few, and hopefully we then have some questions from the audience. Some of it took me back to my own childhood. I hated to be taken to the grandparents because they make you work on the farms. I like to eat the things, but not to work. But so it's really interesting to hear about this. Let's start with the history of agricultural systems. So you work at the intersection of nutrition, environment, and agricultural viability in farming. But before we discuss some of these issues, let's look at how agriculture has changed over the past century, bringing both challenges and opportunities. So let me start with the fact that you shared your experience of growing up on traditional small farm in Zimbabwe and what agriculture was like, which was more labor-intensive practices and knowledge system in that era, which was passed down from generation to generation. So a number of questions on this. First is, in your view, did this look significantly different from traditional agriculture in the global north prior to modernization of agricultural practices, both in terms of actual practices and the dissemination of knowledge? And related to that, you have talked about farm diversity. What did this mean in terms of crops, livelihood, livestock, soil, stewardship, and nutrition? So I wanted to take those first. Yeah.
Where do I start? All right. I think in terms of history, no one country has developed without investing in agriculture. We talk of agriculture as being the first rudder in the ladder. You start by investing in agriculture, you're labor intensive, but you move into manufacturing. And as you saw, agriculture contributes to all the sustainable development goals. What it means is you'll need to have a developed energy industry to support agriculture. You'll need to have a developed infrastructure investment program for your roads, for transportation, whether within a country or for export. You also need a good manufacturing platform. So you move from basic production, processing industry, and then you go into service industry. Now, let's talk a bit maybe about the production side. Your question was, how has that changed? I think as we spoke about the push for economic gain, the lens was changed into, if you look at corn, it has 80 to 100 byproducts that you can generate. You can do your glucose, you can do your, so how do we use this commodity as a trading commodity to make money? The narrative then became clear your fields and produce just corn. But what that did not look at is the soil that is hosting this corn will need to be fed. We found a solution. We said you would have pesticides to kill all the bad things you don't want in the soil. You will have fertilizer. But what we forgot was that the organic structure of that soil will be changed by having that one crop. Unfortunately, because of the economic pull, it was don't stop, keep going. Technologies will be generated to deal with the soil, but they never came onto the table. So to answer your question is that the push has been for more commodities, not more food. Then we end up with corn, which does not have zinc, which does not have the micronutrients, and then we start adding them. We created factories for fortification. In my country and other countries, there's a regulation that the quality of your corn meal, the milled corn which forms our staple, is tested for the fortificants that are added on. Yet we could get all those from the soil before. And the worst thing is you're leaving nothing in the soil as well, which the soil needs. So what have we done? We've gone extractive. We've gotten more, but now we are pushing for more for less. But even more, we are looking at a multi-crop system because most of what we've taken out, we can get through either rotation or by having multiple crops on the same field. So we are moving away from the green revolution, which said, keep it all green and get more money. We're saying, keep it rainbow, just like my grandmother's farm was. We had the soy, we had the sugar beans, we had the yams, we had the sweet potato for our breakfast, we had the cereals, we had the corn and the sorghum, but we also had the livestock, which provided fertilizer for the soil. So I think this is now the challenge. How do you get more for less? And less being the inputs which have become costly. So that is what has changed. And when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we're really saying, what can we restore back to our soils for us to create the balance? Balance in the economy, balance in the social, and balance in the environment. And that's what sustainable development is about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the evolution of agriculture and food systems. So modern monoculture replaced traditional farming in the 20th century, and the Green Revolution, which you mentioned now, as was heralded as solving food crisis in the 1960s. So given the legacy of this revolution and what came after it, can you talk more about that Green Revolution and the benefits and trade-off? You started talking about it. Can you expand on that? Then what economic changes did this bring for farmers and their communities? And what about reliance on external inputs like fertilizers, machinery and fuel, which you also highlighted?
So as I said, most of our research centers are over 50 years old. And one of the best things that came out of our CGIAR research centers is that we have our godfather, Norman Borlaug, who generated a seed for wheat and maize and rice and took it to Asia during the West food deficit era. People were dying of hunger. And hunger was synonymous to lack of calories, not hunger as in nutrient density. So these seeds were taken to Asian countries. The best part was that government came in with irrigation policy and fertilizers. So there was massive investment, but the game changer was the seed, which meant very high yields because they got the water, the fertilizer. They saved lives. So this was celebrated through the Norman Borlaug and his counterpart from Asia, Swaminathan. I'm honored in a way. Last year, I received the Swaminathan Award, and I'm supposed to take the Green Revolution to Africa. But I say Africa doesn't need a green revolution. We still are lagging behind in terms of yield per hectare, but maybe more than yield per hectare, we now need nutrient density per hectare. If you look at most of our African countries, stunting of children because of lack of macronutrients and underfeeding in the first 1,000 days of life, both in utero and postpartum, is up to 30 to 50%. Now, the sad thing with that is that if you cannot redress that up to 2 years of age, it becomes irreversible damage. And that damage doesn't mean a short child. We've always said stunting is your short. No, the brain is stunted. Now, fast forward, if we have 30 to 50% stunting rates in countries now, can you imagine when these kids, 30 years from now, 40 years, are the leaders in these countries? It will mean 1 in 2 people in that country are underdeveloped in terms of their brain power. How do you run a country like that? So these are the ramifications of maybe not dealing with nexus issues in a balanced way, where we've got more calories, but they're empty calories. They're causing health damage, which is irreversible, and you could have done it right by learning. So your question, how do we do it better? Yes, Africa needs to improve productivity, but can we learn from the Asia Green Revolution? They are now leading on what they call the evergreen revolution, and they're going back for sustainable food systems. They no longer want more yield. They want now nutrient dense and diverse diet. And that's where we should be going.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the climate, energy, and the relationship to agriculture. So organizations like CGIAR are working to restore health, soil health and reintroduce regional specific crops as a way of adjusting reliance on fertilizers and pesticides, as well as restoring the ecosystem health and increased biodiversity. So I have a questions about this. What are the energy and climate implications of the transitioning to more diverse farming systems and potential implications for overall food system resilience? And then in recent years, what's called opportunity crops have come up as a potential geographically specific approach to climate policy in agriculture. Can you talk about this concept and how it compares to the modern concept of regenerative agriculture, which you mentioned, and why these terms are contentious?
Maybe let me start with the transition. Any transition is difficult and complex, and we all want to hold on to what we are comfortable with. And I'm not shy to say that fossil fuels have driven the agriculture development because you need the energy. The whole cycle is energy dense. Unfortunately, most of our countries' discovery of fossil fuels is on the rise. How do you have a just transition? Just meaning people still have to eat, business has to continue, people need the jobs, but at the same time, you try and do it in a way that does less damage as you move to a more friendlier way of meeting your energy needs. that's the big global debate. And the debate is for countries that did not cause the damage, can't we have a fund that will allow them to leapfrog into new technologies? I run a farm and I've managed to get off grid and put it all on solar. Pressure from my son who runs that. But the challenge is it's expensive. It's capital and it's expensive. Not everybody can afford it. And unfortunately, the returns from nature are not visible every day. You don't eat that. As you are looking at a production race, you want to see produce. So can we have resources that will buffer the farmers, help them to leapfrog to a new technology? If those resources don't come, it means we continue polluting until such a time that solar energy, renewables are affordable. That is not in the horizon. Most countries have tried to reduce import tariffs on all that, but that doesn't help the farmer. The farmer wants to do good. They've always done good. They've been good stewards of the soils in most cases. But if you now want them to invest in a new technology, can we have policies that lift them faster? And currently, what is the limiting factor is money. You need to have affordable, accessible technologies that will be a better alternative for moving from fossil fuels. And as I say, currently, they're not affordable. They're there, but anything that's there but not affordable is as good as not there. So to your question of how do you make it happen, I really think that going back to that discussion on the loss and damage and trying to strike a balance on expediting those resources to help business to continue in a friendlier and less damaging would be a good solution. As that is still under discussion, let's try and look inward. And that's where vision for adapted crops and soils come in. We are saying don't stop producing food, but look for those foods that are already nutrient dense, that are climate smart, and walk that path, almost move away from those food crops that fail every year because they need irrigation, they're not climate smart. So I would say that would be the short-term answer, but long-term, we just need to bring technologies closer to the farmers, and affordability is the key. Now, here's the challenge. If the farmers cannot afford a cheaper technology, it means the price to the consumer remains high. So, and then you have more standard kids. So really, you need massive Marshall game where we say, how do we balance the energy supply, the production system, the food system, and healthy people. So we talk about healthy diets for a healthy planet and healthy people. And unless we can balance that, and energy is a key driver to all that.
Thank you very much. And this is really very interesting, and it's a paradox that in a context in which so many African countries in the last decade have discovered oil or some other resource and have so much money coming in, and still there is no focus on what to do with that money to, for instance, in the area of agriculture, there's just so much excitement among the elites to grab, the resources, which is a big challenge. So I will turn it over to the audience now. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then we have a microphone that will come to you. Can you please, identify yourself and make the question brief?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name's Brianna Parsons. I'm from the vet school. I'm a veterinarian, so from New Bolton Center. Unfortunately, couldn't see you yesterday because I've been working in the Gambia in West Africa for about 10 years and just traveled back. So you were very much speaking my language. Really, really enjoyed the nuance in your presentation. And what I'm thinking about, you said CGIAR is trying to do research, not for publication, but for impact. Love that. And so I'm wondering, you identified that a lot of these centers are commodity focused. So I'm wondering whether CGIAR is thinking about establishing new centers that are more sustainable agriculture focused. And then the second part to that is whether there's a role to bring in the private sector and work directly with farmers, and whether there can be more like on-farm research that is informing what are the best practices.
Can we take, a set of 3 questions and then you?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Katie Bailey. I work in an office here at Penn called the Environmental Innovations Initiative. And my question was in response to something you mentioned during your talk about kind of disincentives to investment in technologies that could address climate because of climate risk, disincentive in technologies that could improve production. And I wondered if you could just maybe comment a little more on that, how that kind of shows up and ways of overcoming that resistance to invest in this space.
Okay, since we have 3 questions now, I think you should respond to these 3
All
questions.
right,
first.
thank you. Thank you for the energy you gave me on stage. I got lots of smiles from that angle. So your question is on CGIAR, commodity-based. I showed the picture. We currently have 15 centers. As you say, all commodity-based. ARUA is livestock, CIMIT is maize and wheat, SIP is potatoes. So the best thing that has happened in CGIAR, 2016 we tried, but I think 2021 we did very well, is that we decided to come under one umbrella, which we call one CGIAR. What that means is that you can now work or develop programs across centers. As I showed, the VAX program is hosted by CIMIT, which is a maize and wheat center. But because they're leading in systems transformation, they were found to be the right home for Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. As you saw from the catalog, we don't have maize and wheat there. We've got okra, which by right should belong to the World Vegetable Center, but they work in partnership with okra. So the big thing in CGIAR now is the partnership strategy that we are driving under one CGIAR. You are no longer looking at Norman Borlaug, who, by the way, came from CIMIT, Mexico, to Asia. We are looking at CIMIT under one CGIAR, feeding towards food systems transformation, water systems transformation, and land transformation. That's our new way of working under the new strategy. So the one CGIAR is the umbrella board where I sit, and each center is independent, is over 50 years old, and they still do work on what they previously did. On the issue of publications, yes, we still publish. Any scientist climbs the ladder, but we ask the question, how are you feeding to our impact scorecard on the 5 impact areas? But more than that, how are you partnering with private sector? We've done very well on partnerships with private sector on seed. That's why seed can be found in a rural shop, hybrid seed where you buy Coca-Cola. It used to be big competition in Africa that, well, how come you can buy Coca-Cola in a remote village and you can't get seed and fertilizer? Because of partnerships with private sector. And by private sector, I don't mean big business. I mean homegrown, local. We now have amazing seed brigades. These are youths who've come together to form a private sector company, and they are agro dealers, which are shops within the rural, real remote areas that have advisory services on which seed to buy for which area, which pesticides, so the system is ticking, and the partnerships with private sector. Now, on the question of how do you overcome the challenges in terms of disincentives for adopting technologies? It's a policy game. For any policy-making institution, which is government, they are the ones who make policy, we implement policy. There are winners and losers at any one time. The big thrust in most of African countries and most of the low middle income countries, I keep making reference to Africa, even though we work in Asia, is that this is the continent that's been left behind. And what has made it remain behind is poor policy environment. We had policies that promote imports at the expense of local producers. A producer cannot thrive in an environment where there's poor road network, where there's poor energy supply. But because Ministry of Agriculture is not connected to the National Development Plan in terms of working with the Ministry of Infrastructure, you find whatever dreams you have from school of I will grow my maize or corn yield 10 times, you cannot operationalize that. But more and more, I think our governments are realizing that you need a conducive, evidence-based policy. And by evidence, there's no better source than science. And that's where CGIAR, which is the largest public funded institution on generating innovations that are for public good use, becomes a good partner. It partners with government institutions, which are the national research institutions, and generates evidence to inform policy. So those national development plans have to be developed in partnership with UN organizations like FAO, guiding and sharing best practices between countries. But the bottom line is got to be evidence-based. Don't politicize the development, use evidence. What's been tried, what's adapted, what's local, and what thrives. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we take another set of questions? I think I saw a hand at the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Will Crawford. I'm a Master of Environmental Studies student. And I can only really speak to my experience back in Australia. But regenerative agriculture was such a controversial topic. Why is that?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm sure you enjoyed the reference to your Australian colleague.
I certainly did. Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Okay.
Did I?
Yes, go ahead. Please.
Yeah. I think your first question was, why do we resist change? Why don't we move? I listened to a very interesting podcast by Ken. I'm terrible with names, but I'll remember. Ken Giller. You should read that. He coins it beautifully. He says, we have a problem. Whenever you come with a new term, you steal bits from others, ride on your own horse, and it's got to be the only horse in the race, and you've got to be the winner. But really, if you go to the basics, what's the difference between conservation agriculture? What's the difference between regen agriculture? It's really the fundamentals are the same. Let's admit, with more knowledge, we notch it up, but the fundamentals are the same. Then we spend more energy fighting about, why did you put a comma here? It doesn't make sense. But let's go to the basics. The fundamentals are protect the soil, protect the environment, deliver quality food at minimum damage. If you coin that, call it anything, but the trendy term for now is regen, and it's got its 10 principles. It's got its checklist, just like under conservation agriculture, we had a checklist. But really, it's a notch up, but the fundamentals to me are the same.
Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Aline, and I'm doing PhD in chemical engineering, but I'm from Rwanda. So my question is more of food security part. So given that like the USAID shut down, and the impact it's going to have on like refugee camps in different countries in Africa, given like the food they were getting, the nutrients these kids were getting, what is your take on that? Like in terms, do you think governments are going to work on that, on like, giving the supplements that the USAID was giving, or like, how do you see this in general? Thank you.
Any other questions so that she can take a set? Okay, go ahead.
Gives me a chance to say skip. Next question. Yeah, Ellen, thank you for that question. So, yes, we've been hard hit globally. I mean, real big time. But I want to believe that poverty is the mother of invention. We just have to think in other terms. Yeah? You've got to fill the gap. It hurts, but there's got to be a homegrown solution whilst things are being sorted out. We want to believe they will be sorted out, but in the meantime, how do we fill the gap? And the good thing that's been happening, thanks to the World Food Program, in terms of the feeding, and most of that food, you rightfully say, has come from the north, is that they had started a very good scheme of local purchases. Most of the food that was flown into these refugee camps came from the north, but there was pressure in the last 5 years to say, surely can't we source locally? I don't know the exact percentage, but there's now a significant amount that is sourced locally. It became a way to provide better income from farmers, for farmers in the specific countries which are hosting refugees, but it also was good for the palate, that instead of eating soya mince, you are now eating beans, which is what Rwanda likes, right? So hopefully, you know, it means more production locally, but the issue will be financing. Where will you get the money to pay those farmers? And I think that's something that we need to zero in globally and fill the gap. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Sibanda. So I will invite Thabo to close here.
But I'll just say thank you all for coming to today's event. Just a round of applause for our moderators and our speakers. Thank you. And just some housekeeping things. So the presentation will be was recorded and will be available on the Kleinman Center website as of tomorrow. And if you want more on this topic, Professor Sibanda will be appearing on the Energy Policy Now podcast, which is a podcast produced by the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. So you should tune into that in the next month. And we invite you to pick up lunch. Lunch is outside the room. And so you can either pick it up and leave, or you can stay in the room. We have it available for another 30 minutes. If you had a question or something you wanted to chat with both our moderator and our guest about, please feel free to approach them afterwards. But thank you all so much for spending the afternoon with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Thank you. Thank you.